Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Are We on the Same Page? This is my fifth video out of six on my series of the history invention. And today I'm going to talk about the top 20 inventions of the Industrial Revolution, which I'm defining as being between 1750 and 1899. And there were lots of really great inventions during this period. And that wasn't such a great time to be living in for a lot of reasons, particularly working conditions. But there was a lot of really great invention and innovation going on. I mean, it was the age of power. It started with the age of steam. Shortly after that, we got electricity, and that allowed for some pretty amazing inventions, which we all enjoy today. So anyway, let's begin. So first, before I begin, I want to give another plug for my book, My Spiritual Journey. This is available on Amazon. You can either buy it in Kindle or in paperback, and you can look for my name, my pen name, Dave Thomas Rocker. That's what you should search for if you want to look for it. And I think you'll enjoy this book. It's got a lot of useful quotes, I think, about how to be a good person and live a good life, and I think you may find it helpful. So anyway, that's just a plug for my book, and let's get started. So before I get started with a countdown of what I consider the top 20 inventions of the Industrial Revolution, I'm going to briefly go over these six eras of human history. I've divided human history into six eras, and these aren't set in stone. I mean, a lot of it's kind of open to interpretation, but I think most people, or at least most historians, can agree with these general eras of human history. I mean, we started with the Stone Age. This was before agriculture, before civilization as we know it. We were basically just, one with nature, just kind of part of the natural environment. But, there were a lot of great inventions during this time. And that was my first series. I did the 10 greatest inventions of the Stone Age, which I'm defining between 5 million BC and 10,000 BC. And then the next big era was ancient times, and this was the beginning of civilization. Starting with agriculture, then we had cities, then we had a lot of the great civilizations I'm sure you guys learned about in history, like ancient Egypt and ancient Greece and ancient Rome, and also a lot of ancient China and India and the Middle East, all that. They did a lot of great stuff during that time. And that lasted from about 10,000 BC to about 500 AD, and I listed the top 20 inventions from that era because there were lots of key inventions. And then the third era I did was the Middle Ages, also known as the medieval era. And this one, this is open to interpretation, but I'm defining it as being between 500 AD, which is roughly the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, until 1499, the end of the 16th, the 15th century. That's usually regarded a little later than the end of the Renaissance. Most people, I mean, the beginning of the Renaissance, which is usually regarded as being around 1450, but I like to keep round numbers, so I made it 1499. I don't think it really made a difference. But I listed what I consider the top 10 inventions of the Middle Ages, since there wasn't a lot of innovation during the Middle Ages. It was also known as the Dark Ages for a lot of good reasons. So I listed the top 10 inventions in the Middle Ages. There's still some pretty key inventions. Then I did the Renaissance. That was last week. Renaissance involved a big flood of new ideas. Renaissance means rebirth, and it really was the rebirth of the Western world, Europe, I guess. In other words, we hadn't quite discovered the New World yet, although we did during this era. But there was a lot of great ideas floating around at that time, and a lot of them shaped our society in some very important ways. And there were some pretty amazing inventions and innovations during the Renaissance. And what I'm doing today is the Industrial Revolution. I'm going to do what I consider the top 20 inventions of the Industrial Revolution, which was another very innovative era. Even though living conditions weren't so great, there was a lot of new invention and a lot of new ideas going around, which ultimately led to the last year on my list, the modern era, which I'm defining as between 1900 and 2024. I realize it's now 2025, but it's still early in 2025. And as far as I can tell, we haven't had any great inventions yet so far this year. But we're only 20 days into the year, so what do you expect? But anyway, I'll do this next week. And there have also been a lot of really amazing inventions in modern times, which I'll get to next week. I'll do another 20, my last 20. So anyway, that's just kind of an overview of the eras. So let's begin with the Industrial Revolution. So what do I have for number 20 on my list? The skyscraper. And I don't think we can deny that skyscrapers was a pretty revolutionary invention. I mean, before the late 19th century, all buildings were most about 5 or 6 stories tall, and they couldn't really build them any bigger. I mean, I'm going to get to this later, but the key invention that made skyscrapers possible was the safety elevator. I mean, that's why we were able to build these things, because skyscrapers would not have all been practical if we didn't have elevators to go up and down. I mean, for one thing, very hard to walk up 10 or more floors. This was the first skyscraper. This building is from Chicago. It's the insurance, the home insurance building in Chicago. Chicago was the first city in the world to have skyscrapers, by the way. And one reason for that is they had a big fire in 1871. Maybe you guys heard about the Chicago fire that was started by this woman who accidentally left her lantern in the shed and the cow kicked it over. There's even a song about it. And I guess the city was so dry at the time that it set the whole city on fire, and it burned down practically the whole city because all the buildings were made of wood at that time. So it was a very devastating fire that almost destroyed the whole city of Chicago. So they had to rebuild it. And one way they rebuilt it was, not shortly after that, they built the first skyscrapers. I mean, it was the Industrial Revolution, even in the United States. So, and the population was growing quite a bit in Chicago, so they needed bigger buildings, to have people work. And, so anyway, that was the beginning of skyscrapers. Pretty key invention. And of course, now we have huge ones. I mean, this was the first, but now the biggest skyscraper in the world is the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. I've never been there, but I heard it's a pretty amazing building. It's like half a mile tall. I guess in metric, 2,722 feet or 163 stories. I guess in metric, it's 829.8 meters. Huge building, and I'd like to see it someday. I have been to, what used to be the tallest building in the world when I was a kid. Tallest skyscraper in the world was the Empire State Building. Then later, shortly after that, they built the World Trade Center. I think you guys all know the original World Trade Center got knocked down in a tragic event, September 11th, 9/11. Some terrorists knocked it down with some airplanes. And now there's a new building in New York called Trade Center 1 that they built where that used to be. That's even taller than it was. It's 1,776 feet, out of I guess, July 4th, 1776, when our country was founded. And it's called Trade Center 1 or Freedom Towers. And I have been there. Pretty amazing building. They also have a big memorial, where the one of the original buildings used to stand, honoring all the people who died. It was about 3,000 people who died in that tragedy. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked here. Let's go to number 19. So like I already mentioned this one, the safety elevator. So skyscrapers, like I said, skyscrapers would not have been possible without this invention, the safety elevator, which was invented by a very famous guy named Otis, Alicia Otis. I think you guys know about the Otis Elevator Company. A lot of buildings still have Otis elevators. They made elevators for skyscrapers for many decades after he invented it. And he invented the first safety elevator in 1853. There were elevators before this, but they weren't safe. They were kind of pulled up and down by pulleys with ropes, and the ropes could break. But this one had a safety mechanism. It had a platform, so in case the rope broke, the platform would stay in place. It was a chain, the platform was attached with a chain. So So elevators are safe because of Otis, and that's why we have them in skyscrapers now. So it was a really key invention. Number 18, dynamite. Okay, it seems like every era involves a destructive invention. And it really, this is kind of a tragedy, I think. I mean, dynamite, we all know it's destructive power. I mean, but it was invented by a pacifist, believe it or not. It was Alfred Nobel. The same Nobel for the Nobel. He also started the Nobel Prizes. There's like 5 different Nobel Prizes for outstanding intellectuals in different fields that are awarded every year. I think there's like, let's see if I can remember the categories. One of them is peace, because he was a pacifist. Maybe I don't have to say the other ones, but literature, chemistry, physics, one other one, biology, I think. There's no Nobel Prize in math. Maybe before I go on, I'm just going to explain why there's no Nobel Prize in math. There is the Fields Medal in math, which is kind of considered the equivalent of the Nobel Prize. But the reason there's no Nobel Prize in math, at least this is the reason I've heard, was that Nobel's best friend was a mathematician who ended up having an affair with his wife. So he got very jealous, and he took out his jealousy on the entire mathematics community by not offering a Nobel Prize in math, which I don't think was very fair because I'm a mathematician. I never slept with his wife. So anyway, enough of that. But he did invent dynamite, and the reason he invented dynamite was it was in 1867. He was convinced that dynamite was so destructive that he thought it would make warfare unthinkable. He thought it would end war because he thought that since we now have dynamite and we could, in principle, use it in wars, he thought that people wouldn't be fighting wars anymore. Well, guess what? It didn't stop war. No invention has ever stopped war. And Einstein had a famous quote about this. He said, "You can't simultaneously prevent and prepare for war." So it looks like weapons can't stop war. I mean, if anything, I think they even make it more attractive to a lot of people because the more destructive power you have, I guess, if you're really power hungry, you'll figure out ways to use the most powerful weapons you have for victory, and that seems to be the case with just about all the weapons that have ever been made. Except for I guess hydrogen bombs. We've never used a hydrogen bomb in a war, and I hope we never do. We have used the A-bomb, and we did use them at the end of World War II, as I'm sure you guys all know. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's the only times we've ever used them in a war, but, I hope it doesn't happen again. And dynamite's bad enough, I think. But in all fairness, dynamite does have other good, practical uses. It's also used to destroy abandoned buildings so we can build new ones in their place. So I guess it has some good uses too. But anyway, that's dynamite. Number 17, the typewriter. I think this was a pretty great invention. I mean, there aren't too many typewriters left. People don't really use typewriters anymore because now we have PCs. We have word processors, right? I mean, you still have keyboards on PCs, like we used to have on typewriters. Yeah, there's still the same keyboard that was used on these old typewriters. It's called the QWERTY keyboard. And there's a funny story about that. I mean, why do we use the QWERTY keyboard, which isn't a very convenient keyboard? I mean, it's not at all optimal. And as a matter of fact, there was another keyboard that was designed, I think, in the 1950s. It was known as the Dvorak keyboard, which was designed so that to give optimize typing speed because you'd have the most common letters in the middle, where they're easier to get to, and the most rare ones on the outside. And actually, what's interesting is the inventor of the typewriter. I guess that was there were a couple of them, Christopher Lee and Carlos Glidden. What they found, the first typewriters were manual, obviously, because electric typewriters came much later. So you had these manual typewriters like the one on this picture. And this was invented in 1868, by the way. And what happened was that if at first they tried. I think these guys tried to do a more optimal design of the keys on the keyboard, but what happened was the keys would get jammed. Because it was a manual device and they were typing too fast. So the keys would keep getting jammed. So they purposely made it harder to type. They moved the keys around so that some of the more common letters were now on the outside, some of the less common letters were on the inside, and people were typing slower. I think you could type about 50% faster if you optimize the position of the keys. So they slowed it down enough so that the keys wouldn't jam. And I guess this was practical until we had electric typewriters by the 1950s, and then it didn't make sense anymore. But I guess what happened was everybody got so used to using the old QWERTY keyboard they didn't want to switch. They would have had to learn to type using another keyboard, and they didn't want to do that. Just like nobody wanted to go metric. So I guess people get used to old ways of doing things, even if they're not as efficient. I think it probably would have been better if we'd gone to Dvorak and people just forced themselves to learn it. But anyway, I just think that's an interesting story. But we can't deny the importance of typewriters. I mean, they did revolutionize writing. Because think about it. I mean, before typewriter, people were pretty much handwriting everything. And, I mean, typing is a lot faster and it's a lot more legible. So the advantages of typing are pretty obvious. So that's a typewriter. Number 16. This is a really important one. The X-ray machine. I mean, I think just about all of us have gone to doctors and gotten X-rays. I mean, at least a dentist. I mean, this is kind of a routine. When doctors check dentists check your teeth. Maybe it's not every visit, but once a year or two, they like to take X-rays of your teeth because they want to make sure that your teeth are okay, that there's no abscess teeth or cavities or any of that. And, X-rays are a really amazing device. And it was invented by this physicist named Röntgen. And it was an accidental discovery. He was playing around with these cathode rays. I mean, he was playing around with early versions of the cathode ray tube, CRT, which is the same thing in the old television sets. I mean, this was way before television, obviously. This is the late 19th century. But what he found when he was playing around with these cathode rays was that, if you shined them on, I think it was, I don't remember, some kind of fluorescent material, it would make a green glow. He wasn't sure what this green glow was, but then he found when he put his hand through it, he could see through his hand. It would make an image on a piece of paper, and it would show the bones in his hand. That was X-rays. So it turned out this green light was really X-rays. And it turned out he didn't know what they were at first. They were called Röntgen rays before we knew what they were. What it turned out they were was just a high-energy form of electromagnetic radiation, just like light. I mean, there's the electromagnetic spectrum is something like 80 octaves or, 30 orders of magnitude, goes all the way, down to the lowest frequency radio waves. Those are the lowest energy electromagnetic waves. It goes through, that, and then it goes through microwaves. It goes through infrared light, visible light, ultraviolet light, and past ultraviolet light is X-rays, which is a very high energy form of radiation. It's also dangerous if you expose yourself to too much of it. It can harm your tissue. But beyond X-rays, you have gamma rays, which are even more harmful. But he discovered X-rays, and X-rays will penetrate flesh, and they'll penetrate with what they do. I know a lot of physics. What they do is they penetrate materials that have a low atomic number. They're low on the periodic table, so it'll penetrate water really easily because that's just hydrogen, oxygen. It'll also penetrate flesh because that's mostly, organic compounds like carbon and phosphorus and sulfur. Those are all low on the electromagnetic spectrum. But it won't penetrate your bones because your bones have a higher atomic number. I mean, they have calcium, so it has a harder time going through calcium, and especially metals like iron. That's why X-rays will not penetrate metals. So if you look at this picture on the bottom, this is the first X-ray that was ever taken. Röntgen did this himself. It's an X-ray of his wife's hand. And it's a pretty amazing X-ray because she was wearing her wedding ring, and you can see it very clearly. You can see the bones in her hand. You can also see the wedding ring she's wearing, but you can't see the flesh part of her fingers, and that's what makes X-rays so remarkable. You can see the inside of the human body, and obviously not just for dentistry, but for, I think, more critically for medicine. It was a revolutionary invention because you can treat diseases this way, or you can see what's inside your body. Maybe there's some things like stuck in your body. Maybe you have broken bones. You can see where your fractures are, and then you know what to repair. So obviously a very important invention. Number 15, the sewing machine. Seems like every era I've been featuring a device involved in textile manufacturing, and sewing machine was really kind of an individual machine. But it was a really revolutionary machine because it allowed people to sew so much more easily than they could before. I mean, he had a machine that would do it automatically. I've never even sewed in my life, but you have to take a needle, you have to, you have a thread through a needle, and you pull it through the clothes or whatever kind of, material you're trying to sew together. It takes a long time because you have to do it back and forth, hundreds of times maybe. Sewing machine, you can do it like 100 times faster. And the old models, they were mechanical. You still had to pedal them, but they were so much more faster and more efficient and allowed tailoring. It revolutionized tailoring because tailors had to do this. And so now you could alter clothes a lot faster and revolutionize the tailoring industry. And pretty great invention, I'd say. Yeah, and eventually we got electric sewing machines by the 1970s. So now it's even easier to sew. Though I haven't seen a sewing machine in a long time. But anyway, it was a pretty great invention. Number 14, the steamboat. This is another invention I don't think we can deny the importance of. I mean, you don't see too many steamboats anymore, but it was the first boat that used steam power. I mean, it really was very important in the 19th century. I mean, the first one, I guess, was built in 1783. I don't think there were too many that were used in the 18th century, but I'm sure you guys all know about the steamboats that were used in the United States along the Mississippi River in particular. I think Mark Twain kind of immortalized the steamboat with his books like The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And, I think well into the 20th century, there were a lot of steamboats that still were going up and down the Mississippi River. So, pretty critical invention. They didn't just use them on rivers. I mean, they used them overseas as well. They used them a lot in Europe. It was a very, it made seafaring much more feasible because you could go against the current. You could go on the ocean a lot more easily than you could before. So very, very important invention. Unfortunately, one unfortunate consequence of the steamboat was that it contributed to the slavery in the South. I mean, as you guys probably know, that in the South, the African American slaves were picking cotton, and it was a big, huge industry in the South, and the steamboats kind of assisted that whole industry because they would ship the cotton up north. It was a big trade. But anyway, kind of a dark period of American history, but that was the steamboat. We can't deny its importance. And number 13, refrigeration. I mean, this was a really important invention, as I'm sure you guys all know. I guess the first kind of mechanical or automatic refrigerator is shown on the bottom here. This was Jacob Perkins who built this device, and it used the same principle that's used today. I mean, I don't know how many guys know this, but the way refrigerators or freezers work is they have this gas called Freon. I think nowadays they use Freon, but the idea is that it actually separates the heat. When some side gets hot, there's coils in the back of your refrigerator that get hot. There's a motor inside that uses this Freon you kind of separate the gases. I don't know the principle that well, but it does get the inside of your refrigerator or freezer very cold. That's how you're able to preserve food. And obviously, this was a very important invention because, before the refrigerator, I think a lot of food would go bad very quickly, particularly meat. And as a matter of fact, there's another thing I didn't mention on this slide, but you might wonder why so many cultures throughout the world have spicy food, mostly southern climates. Most of Latin America, they eat a lot of spicy foods. They do in India too. And you might wonder how spices became so popular. Well, I learned this a long time ago. Before we had refrigeration, spice was about the only way we had to preserve meat that went bad. And it didn't even really preserve it. I mean, I think some spices did help preserve the meat, but I think mostly they just made it taste better. Because the meat would get, as you guys probably know, when meat spoils, it gets very rancid. I mean, tastes really bad, especially fish, and it can make you sick too. But I guess they would get rid of a lot of the stench with the spices they use. So it was kind of a way to mask, the stench of rotten meat. But we had to deal with all that before we had refrigeration. So obviously, refrigeration was a very important invention. Um, Number 12, the mechanical reaper. This is a very important innovation in farming and agriculture. And, I am a little bit of a novice on this, but I know that, I guess the first mechanical reaper was invented in 1831, and it was invented by a guy named Cyrus Hall McCormick. He was an American, I guess he was a farmer, and he wanted to grow grain more efficiently, and this reaper allowed him to do that. It was a very efficient machine for, as they say, reaping the grain out of the ground. It had these blades in it that went in and out. It was kind of a mechanical device that mechanized what was before a very painstaking process of reaping grain, which people had to do by hand with like plows and machetes or whatever. Now you had a big device that was run by horses. Now we have even more efficient ways to do this. But this is kind of the beginning. This is the mechanization of agricultural manual labor. It was a very key invention. And anyway, so that was the mechanical reaper. And then number 11. Now we're getting some big ones here. The electric telegraph. I mean, this was a really revolutionary invention. I don't think we use telegraphs too much anymore, but they were used for a really long time. I mean, the telegraph. I think the amazing thing about the telegraph is that it was the first form of basically instantaneous communication all over the world. I mean, with the telegraph, it was the first electronic form of communication. And it didn't use your voice, and it relied on a code. I mean, the guy who kind of perfected the United States was this guy named Samuel Morse, so I'm sure you're all familiar with. He invented the Morse code. He did not invent the telegraph. That was done a little bit earlier by some guys in Europe, I think. Göttingen University. Actually, there were a couple of physicists who made the first telegraph. Very famous guys. Carl Friedrich Gauss and James Webber in 1833. They made the first telegraph and they demonstrated it. But their telegraph only went like about 1 mile. I mean, it was at Göttingen University. They just kind of demonstrated it. But later, people developed, bigger telegraphs, and they started transmitting messages over long distances. And pretty soon they were transmitted all over the world. And, instantaneous communication overseas, all over the world, just with this code, this Morse code, which is pretty easy to use. Actually, my uncle was really into what was called amateur radio in the 1950s and early 60s, I guess. And they were still using Morse code back then. I don't think practically anybody uses it anymore. But, ships were using Morse code, and there were people that were amateur, radio transmitters and receivers that people used to send and receive messages. You could communicate with people all over the world if you just knew Morse code. And my uncle learned Morse code and he got really good at transmitting it and receiving it. He could transmit about 22 words per minute. He could receive about 15 words per minute. Not nearly as fast as ordinary speech, but he was able to do it. So he was able to communicate with people all over the world with these amateur radios, and he really enjoyed that. But now I think hardly anybody uses Morse code anymore because now it's easy enough to, just transmit and receive ordinary radio signals, with, I guess even with smartphones, you can do that now. So these are obsolete. But for at least 100 years, over 100 years, they were a really great form of communication. Telegrams, I'm sure you guys know about telegrams. Western Union was sending and, out telegrams to people. So, and that used the telegraph. So that was the electric telegraph. And then number 10. Now we're getting some really big ones now. Photography. I mean, think about how important photography is. We kind of take it for granted today. But, I mean, photography, at least film photography, wasn't invented until 1826. And just think about it. I mean, with photographs, you can take reliable images of anything you want, pretty much. I mean, we didn't used to be able to do that. And this, I mean, I didn't even mention this in this slide, but one consequence of photography was it revolutionized art. It revolutionized painting. I mean, the whole Impressionist movement was inspired by photography because what happened was before the camera, before photography, artists were trying to draw, paint pictures as accurately as possible. I've seen paintings from the 18th century that just show amazing detail on buildings. They almost look like photographs, and that's exactly what the artists were trying to do because we didn't have photography yet. They were trying to make as reliable an image as they could of something in the real world. And once we had photography, they didn't need to do that anymore. So they could experiment with painting a little bit more, and that led to a lot more abstract forms of art, like Impressionism, later Post-Impressionism, later modern art, which included Cubism and all this other really abstract art. That all started because of the camera. So pretty amazing invention. And we used film cameras for a long time. I even used to use them when I was a kid, even as a teenager. I mean, now film cameras are pretty much obsolete. Some people still use them. There are, I guess, artists, kind of photographic artists who still like film cameras because they can get a lot of special effects with film that they can't get with digital cameras. But I just think digital cameras are so much easier to use. I mean, photography used to be a pretty painstaking process when we still used film. I mean, I remember as a kid, you had to be a lot more careful about taking good pictures because film was expensive. And it took a long time to develop, too. I mean, I'd go take a lot of trips with my parents. I'd take a lot of pictures when I was on vacation. And then when I got home, I had to take them into, the drugstore to get them developed, which usually took a week or two. And, the developing was expensive, and, you kind of had to make sure you took good pictures because the film was kind of expensive too. Now, you can just shoot away with your own cell phone, So it's really easy to take pictures now, digital pictures, but we have photography. Film photography was really important for a really long time. And, movies used to be made with film. They're not anymore. I mean, they're converted to film, I guess, but everything's digital now. But anyway, that was photography. Very important invention. Yeah, number 9. Well, this is a good one. The hot air balloon. This was the first device that was used to go through the air, to travel through the air, before airplanes. I mean, this has been a dream of humanity. I'd say probably the whole time we've been a species, I'll bet. I'll bet that people have dreamed of flying. I mean, think about it. I think even the cavemen. Because what are the cavemen doing? I mean, they observe birds, right? We've seen birds our whole life. All over the world, there's birds and there's bats and there's insects. They all fly. And I'm sure people have been wondering, pretty much from the beginning of man, if they can do it, why can't we? And that's what Dorothy asked in The Wizard of Oz, But, I don't think it was just her. I think pretty much everybody's been asking that question, and everybody always wanted to fly. I mean, most of us have had dreams of flying, and, we finally able to get off the ground in 1783 with these hot air balloons. And, yeah, ballooning was very popular for a long time. I mean, and the first hot air balloon, it was made in France. Not 1783. It was Etienne Montgolfier in Annonay, France. He made the first flight in a hot air balloon on October 19th, 1783. And the principle of ballooning is pretty simple. I mean, these are what are called lighter than aircraft. I mean, by contrast, airplanes are heavier than air. They work by lift. The wings give them lift by Bernoulli's principle. But before we were able to use Bernoulli's principle to build flying machines, we had to rely on lighter than air vehicles like hot air balloons. And the way they work, I think you guys probably know this. Hot air is lighter than cold air, so it's the hot air in the balloon that gives it its lift because it has a buoyancy. I mean, the volume of hot air, the weight of equivalent amount of cold air is a lot heavier than the weight of the same amount of hot air inside the balloon. And that difference in weight is the lift of the balloon. If it's big enough, you can hold passengers in it. You can get up to maybe 1,000 pounds of lift, maybe even more, depending on how big your balloon is. And that's how you can go through the air. And you can go up or down. I mean, this is kind of immortalized in the movie Around the World in 80 Days. There's this scene where they're riding in the hot air balloon over France. And, if you want to go up, you just, you heat up some air. And if you want to go down, you just let some out. So, pretty easy. But anyway, pretty remarkable invention. And, we were using ballooning, and we started with hot air balloons. Now we use hydrogen or helium. I don't think we use hydrogen much anymore because hydrogen's very flammable. It's very dangerous. It was responsible for the Hindenburg disaster in 1937. So now I think we use helium. And, we have little helium balloons, too, that I think every kids all love. So that's ballooning. And number 8, gasoline automobile. I don't think any of us can deny the importance of this invention. We use them all over the place. I mean, now we just call them cars, and I think at least most people in the developed world have their own cars now. I have a car, and most people I know have cars, and it's kind of hard to. Unfortunately, our society is so dependent on cars that, at least in the United States, that you kind of can't do without a car anymore. People love cars. I mean, I think, especially when I was a kid, I think the 50s and 60s was kind of the mecca era of cars, I'd say. We had muscle cars, and we had greasers, and we had, people going to the racetracks, and there were a lot of songs about cars, and, teenagers were making out in the back seat of their cars, and, you name it. I mean, cars were great. But it all started because of this invention in 1885 by, I think it was, what's his name? Let's see his name here. But Benz, yeah. I think it's the same Benz of Mercedes-Benz, a German inventor. He invented the first gasoline automobile, and a picture of it is shown on the bottom of the slide. And his was a very, very slow. It only went 10 miles an hour, and its engine was only 0.74 horsepower. It was less than 1 horsepower. Nowadays, most cars, I think my car is around 100 horsepower. I have a Prius. It's not that powerful, but it can go easily 120 miles an hour. It's a very efficient car. It's a hybrid, and gets about 45 miles to the gallon. Pretty revolutionary invention. We can't deny the importance of automobiles. And automobiles wouldn't have even been possible without this next invention, the internal combustion engine. This was invented in 1872, not too long before the first gasoline automobiles. But all gasoline automobiles have an internal combustion engine. That's how they get their power. And, It was the first engine, like the name implies. It was the first engine that was completely inside the vehicle. You didn't have to get anything from outside. You just have to put gasoline in your car, and then the engine would do all the rest. I mean, there's this four. You guys are probably familiar with a four-step cycle for a gasoline engine: intake, what is that? Combustion, power, and exhaust, or compression. So you intake. What happens is, you have I guess a fuel injector in your car, so the it'll mix some air with the gasoline that'll go into the engine. That's the intake part of the cycle. That's where nowadays they use pistons with cylinders. So the cylinder will go. The gas fuel mixer will go into the cylinders. That's the intake. And then once you have the intake, the pistons go down, they compress them. That heats up the gas fuel mixture, and then you ignite the sparks plug. That's the power. That's what makes it explode upward. Gives the car engine its power. And then once all the gas is burned, it goes out the exhaust pipe. That's the exhaust part of the cycle, and then the cycle repeats. And that's how cars can go. So anyway, the guy who invented this was done in 1872 by American named George Brayton, and I guess his design didn't involve the cylinders, but that came shortly afterwards. And, so that's how cars work. That's how car engines work. Pretty amazing invention. And number six, another form of transportation, the steam locomotive. Of course, this came a long time before cars, but this was the beginning of trains. And I actually like trains a lot better than cars. That's probably why I put this invention higher than the gasoline automobile. Because the advantage of trains obviously is they're much more fuel efficient. I mean, you can put a lot of people on a train. The amount of fuel you burn per passenger on a train is much less than on a car. And cars are a problem now. I mean, maybe cars weren't such a big problem in the old days, but now there's so many cars on the road, you get traffic jams everywhere. I mean, I used to live in LA, and anybody who's lived in LA knows that traffic jams are horrible. I mean, you just get stuck in traffic for hours sometimes. You don't have this problem with trains. Trains, at least in Europe, trains are really reliable. I mean, you can set your watch to the trains in Europe. But the first trains ran on steam power. They were very dirty. I mean, yeah, you had to burn wood or coal to ignite to heat up the steam. But they were the first trains. They were the first vehicles that used artificial power to move, and pretty shortly they could get them to go pretty fast. I think already by the end of the 19th century, they had trains that would go close to 100 miles an hour. I mean, trains were pretty amazing, and well, they're very popular too. I mean, I think a lot of kids still like to play with train sets. And, trains are fun. I mean, I don't know, and they're a lot cleaner than the first ones. I mean, now there aren't very many, steam locomotives anymore. I mean, now most trains are electric. They rely on electric rails, and the electricity is generated another way. So we don't have to rely on coal power or wood power anymore for trains. But trains are great. I wish we had more trains. I know that in China and I think parts of Europe, they're already using maglev trains, which can go like 300 miles an hour. They ride on a magnetic wave. This is a much later invention. I may put this under the modern era inventions. Unfortunately, we don't have them in the United States yet. I wish we did. But we still seem to have a love affair with cars here in America. Trains aren't that popular anymore here in the United States, which I think is really unfortunate because, in the 19th century, I think America was a leader in building trains. I mean, the first transcontinental railroad was built in 1869 by a guy named Stanford. I guess that's what Stanford University was named after. And, there was the era of the trains in America, part of the Old West. But ever since we've had cars, people don't really care about trains anymore. At least in this country, they don't, which I think is really unfortunate. But anyway, that's trains. And number five. Now we're getting to some big ones here. I'm gonna tell you a little joke. So I think you guys, if you know a little chemistry, do you know what you get when you mix an acid and a base? Well, if you know basic chemistry, you know you get a salt and water. Actually, that's not quite correct. You get a salt and a battery. Anyway, maybe that was a bad joke. I don't know. But anyway, batteries. That's what I have as number five on my list. And this is a pretty important invention. I mean, this allowed for the first electric circuits. I mean, the guy who invented the battery. This was done in 1800. It might surprise you that we had electricity this long ago, over 200 years ago. We had electric circuits thanks to this physicist named Alessandro Volta. He was an Italian physicist. This was very early in the age of electricity. There was a lot of developments in the whole history of electricity. I mean, I guess the first big one was Benjamin Franklin, who flew the kite in the thunderstorm and discovered that lightning was electricity, but he couldn't really use it. He did invent the lightning rod, but people weren't doing all that much with electricity back then. But then we had other developments, like there was another guy, I can't remember his name, that discovered that an electric current could make a frog's leg kick. And that led pretty shortly afterwards to the invention of the battery. I think it inspired Volta to build the first battery because he realized there was a chemical reaction going on in the frog's leg. And instead of using a frog's leg, he figured out, why don't I actually make a device that can harness an electric current? And he figured out a way to convert chemical energy into electricity. And it's not really that complicated if you know a little bit of basic chemistry. So what he did was he used these two metals, copper and zinc, which I think are still used in batteries today. So I'm gonna explain the physics behind batteries to you. It's not that complicated. So copper is what's called an electropositive element. It generates these positive ions, Cu++, and then zinc is the opposite. Zinc generates negative ions. So what you do is you put these copper and zinc, they're called electrodes, and the copper are what are called the cathodes, and the zinc's the anodes. So the copper will attract electrons, which are negatively charged, and if you put them in an acid solution, I guess he used a brine solution. Nowadays we use sulfuric acid, which is a very strong acid, but you have these hydrogen ions and sulfuric acid, H+. So the ions, which are positively charged, are attracted to the anode, and then the electrons, which are negatively charged, attract the cathode, and that generates an electric current. So if you connect these electrodes to wires, then that will produce an electric current, and that's how you generate DC power, an electric circuit. Pretty neat. So that's how your battery works. Now you know how batteries work, and they were the first way to generate electric power, thanks to Volta. As far as back as 1800, we didn't really have any uses for them back then, but we found uses for electricity in the upcoming decades. A lot of uses for it. So that was the beginning. Number four, radio. I don't think we can deny the importance of radio. I mean, radio was a really revolutionary invention. Think about it. I mean, radio was the first wireless form of transmission of electric power. The radio was the first device that did this. And I guess in order to explain radio, I studied a lot of physics. I know a lot of basic physics. So what radio will rely on, this is another form of electromagnetic wave, by the way. I talked about X-rays earlier. X-rays are a very high energy form of electromagnetic radiation. Well, radio is kind of the same idea, but radio is a very low energy form of electromagnetic radiation. And the guy who discovered the principle of the electromagnetic spectrum was a very famous physicist named James Clerk Maxwell. He did this back in 1864. He came up with a system of four very complicated differential equations that explain everything there is to know about electricity and magnetism, at least the classical theory. And one of his predictions was the existence of electromagnetic waves. And he could even calculate the speed of these waves. It turned out to be the speed of light, the measured speed of light. So he concluded that light was an electromagnetic wave. Well, it turns out it's not the only electromagnetic wave. And then there was a guy named Hertz in 1887, another very famous physicist, a German physicist. He was the first physicist who actually produced radio waves. He just had a little radio circuit. I mean, it wasn't a radio, but he had a circuit that produced an alternating current, and it could generate these waves through the air called radio waves. And I think he didn't even measure those waves. He didn't have a use for them yet. But the first practical use for these radio waves, as the name implies, was radio. And usually the guy who's credited with inventing radio was this Italian guy named Marconi. Actually, it turns out he really wasn't the inventor of radio. He was kind of the popularizer of radio. He was the first person to patent a radio and to actually, make the first practical radio transmission. And there's a picture of him doing that here. He has a radio transmitter and receiver. He's demonstrating the world's first radio. And I think you guys all know radio, after about another 20, 30 years, radio broadcasts became, used throughout the world. I mean, people were listening to radio programs by the 1920s. Radio eventually got turned into television. So we can't deny the importance of radio. But it wasn't really Marconi who invented the first radio. It was actually Tesla, I believe. And there were a couple other pioneers of radio that didn't really get credit for it, but it was mostly Tesla. I mean, I'm just going to say a little bit about Nikolai Tesla now. He was a very tragic figure in the history of science. I mean, he was a genius. He was obviously an amazing genius. He knew electricity, the whole theory of electricity and magnetism better than just about anybody in the world did at that time. And he even knew how to make these amazing devices that used electromagnetic waves. And he figured out how to make the first radio. But his problem was that he was not a businessman. He went to General Electric. He tried to get a job at General Electric. He showed off all these inventions he made. They didn't want to hire him. Instead, they stole his ideas and used it for themselves, which I think was really horrible. So he never, as far as I know, he never even got hired by General Electric, or if he did, they just paid him dirt wages, and he ended up, homeless basically for the latter half of his life because General Electric screwed him and other people used his ideas. So very tragic figure in my opinion. But one guy who did profit from radio was this guy Marconi, and we all know radio was a very important invention. So anyway, that's radio. Number 3, the telephone. I mean, these are big inventions. I mean, who hasn't used a telephone? I mean, telephones are such an important part of our society. I was talking about the telegraph earlier. Well, the telegraph was the first kind of instantaneous form of communication that used electricity. But the problem with the telegraph was you couldn't transmit your voice over a telegraph. You had to transmit these Morse code signals. Well, what Alexander Graham Bell did when he invented the telephone, he came up with this device that could do exactly that. He came up with an electronic device. This is back in 1876. He figured out how to make a device, and the way it works, I'm not an expert on this, but it has a little speaker inside. It has a little microphone inside, I guess. I mean, so what happens is, you talk into a telephone, the transmitter part. The old telephones had the transmitter and the receiver. They had the two things, one you put up to your ear, the other your mouth. I don't know how many of you guys remember those things. We don't use old telephones like we used to. But, you talk into the part on the bottom. And there was a speaker on the bottom, the bottom part of the phone that would vibrate when you talked. because sound is a wave. It would make the speaker membrane vibrate, and then that was connected to an electric circuit. Same way that radio speakers and microphone speakers work. The thing vibrates, and that vibrating signal gets converted into a current that goes through the circuit, and then the current would be transmitted along a telephone wire. We used to have these big telephone lines. I think they still exist. We don't use them that much anymore now. We mostly use cell phones, but you used to have these big telephone wires and telephone poles, and when you made a phone call, the information that you were transmitting with your voice would go along the telephone lines, and the lines would get relayed in a very complicated way. You used to have telephone operators, and you had all these operating stations, and they'd make sure that the signal that you were transmitting, it would go to the telephone number you dialed. The telephone number was like a code of where to send the signal, so it would end up at the house of the people you were calling, and then they would receive your signal in the other end of the telephone. That would cause another speaker to vibrate and reliably transmit the signal you were sending. That's how telephones worked. Yeah, and they still pretty much work that way, except we don't use landlines very much anymore. Those were the old-fashioned telephones. Now we have these nice new devices called smartphones, or the older ones were just cell phones. Now we use cellular towers, and now it's all wireless. So now pretty much every conversation you have over what used to be called telephones is done wirelessly. One of these remarkable devices called smartphones, which rest assured what you'll see in my last video in this series. Probably pretty high up there too. But that was telephones. And number two, I don't think any of us can deny the importance of this one. The incandescent light bulb. This was the first electric source of light. And just think about that. I mean, think about how much this revolutionized our society. Because before we had electric lights, we did have other forms of lighting, but they weren't very reliable. And I mean, mostly we used either oil lamps. There used to be big street lamps. People had to light. They used like whale oil for a long time. That's kind of what spawned the whole whale hunting industry in the 19th century. So they used different forms of oils to light them, but they weren't all that bright. And I mean, you could use them outside, I guess, to light these street lamps. But for indoor lighting wasn't reliable at all. You couldn't get that much light, and you weren't able to do all that much at night. And now we take artificial electric lighting for granted so much. We can see just as easily in nighttime now as we do in the daytime. Just think about how much that revolutionized our society. And now there's so many electric lights in the world, you can see them from space. I mean, I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen pictures of the night side of the Earth from space, and if you look at populated areas all over the world, you can almost see like a population density map just by the where you see the electric lights being used. Pretty amazing. So, that's electric lights. And I can't even imagine where we'd be without them. And yeah, the first lights were these incandescent bulbs, and, they weren't very efficient. I mean, I think only about 10% of their energy was actually generated as visible light. They got very hot. We don't use these too much anymore, which is a good thing because they were very inefficient. They wasted a lot of energy. But, now we have more reliable forms of electric lighting. I mean, we came up with some other ones shortly after, neon lights and fluorescent lights, and the latest development is LEDs. And that'll probably be on my list of modern inventions. LEDs are amazingly efficient. I think they only waste about probably less than half of the energy. They use a very low amount of energy, and they're just as bright. I think with 10 watts, you get the same brightness from an LED light as you do from a 100-watt incandescent light. So LED lights are pretty amazing. But it all started with this incandescent light bulb. And by the way, the guy who's credited with inventing the electric light bulb, I'm sure you guys all know, Thomas Edison. He was the first one to patent the electric light bulb in 1879, and then he did this at Menlo Park. He did a big demonstration in 1880. He was a big industrialist, and he made millions of dollars off the invention of the electric light bulb. He also invented a lot of very other important inventions, like the phonograph. I didn't put that one on my list, unfortunately, or the motion pictures. Those are both also really important inventions he came up with, and a lot of other ones too. So he was a really great inventor, but from what I hear, he was also kind of an asshole. And I think there were other people who contributed to the invention of electric lights, incandescent lights, that didn't get credit. I think I named a couple of them here. One of them was an Englishman named Joseph Swan. He came up with his own incandescent light bulb, I believe in 1878, the year before Edison did. But unfortunately, his didn't work so well. I think he used the wrong material for the filament. I think he used carbon for the filament, whereas I think Edison used tungsten. We still use tungsten for filaments of incandescent light bulb. This is a metal that burns at a very high temperature, and I guess you can last a long time. Carbon, unfortunately, it also burns at a very high temperature, but it burns out very quickly. So they don't last very long. Carbon filaments aren't very reliable. So unfortunately, Swan used the wrong material. But I think there were a couple other guys, I think I even mentioned them here, who were, Humphrey Davy and Alessandro Volta. I already mentioned Volta. He was the one who invented the battery. I guess he also contributed in inventing the electric light bulb, and so did Humphrey Davy. But they don't usually get credit for it. So, anyway, that's the electric light bulb. We can't deny its importance. And what's number one on my list? Can you guys guess? Well, it turns out it's the electric generator. Been talking about electricity and electric devices, and I think it's pretty obvious how electricity has revolutionized our society, our whole way of life. But I think the invention that contributed more than anything else to our use of electricity was the electric generator. This was back in 1831. And this was done by another very famous physicist, Michael Faraday. He was an English physicist. And he was an expert on the whole theory of electricity. And I didn't talk about the whole history of electricity. I think I only went up to Volta. The next really revolutionary discovery in the history of electricity was done by Ørsted. I think Ampere as well. I think it was Ørsted who discovered that an electric current, which we could already generate due to Volta, an electric circuit. What he found was if you put a electric current through a wire, it generated a magnetic field around it. That was a pretty revolutionary discovery. Before that, nobody really knew anything about magnetism. They knew the Earth had a magnetic field. We were using it for navigating, ever since I think the 11th century. So for almost 1,000 years, we'd been using, the magnetic field of the Earth to navigate ships around the world. But we didn't know what it was until Ampere discovered that an electric current could produce a magnetic field. And, I think that intrigued Faraday. He thought, well, if an electric current can make a magnetic field, then maybe we can use a magnetic field to create an electric current, go the other way around. And he did exactly that. It took him a while, but he realized that if you had an electric circuit, if you just had a loop of wire, and you had a changing magnetic flux, in other words, the magnetic field the total magnetic field integrated over the area. I don't want to get too much into the math here, but there's a quantity known as magnetic flux of a circuit, and if that changes with time, according to his law, Faraday's law of electric induction, that will create an electric current in a loop of wire. And that's exactly the principle behind the electric generator. So I can tell you how an electric generator works. So I might as well tell you that since I started talking about it. And I do list it as my number one invention. So why not? Here's how an electric generator works. You start with a big loop of wire. It's not usually a loop. It's what's called a solenoid or a coil. So you have like a big kind of usually a square loop, and it's called a coil because you coil all this wire around it. Usually you use several turns of wire around this. Actually, I think the turns go this way. So you have this big wire, but it's turned many times. You have many turns of wire, usually copper wire. That's the best conductor and one of the best electric conductors. It's also cheap. So you have this big copper wire, usually wired around a frame of metal. I think usually I use iron. And then you have this big electromagnet. That's another thing you have to have. So you have to be able to generate a really powerful magnetic field. And this is another thing you can do with electricity. I didn't list this as one of the great inventions, but there's something called an electromagnet. So the way you can create an artificial magnet, I mean, you can have it's just a natural magnet. I think I talked about magnets already. That's how magnetic compasses work. Iron is what's called a ferromagnetic material. You can magnetize iron, but you can also make what's called an electromagnet. And the way that works, I already talked about Ørsted's law, how an electric current can generate a magnetic field. Well, that has a very practical application. Just take a big coil a lot of wire. Have a big usually big iron thing in the middle. That'll create a very, very powerful magnet known as an electromagnet. And that'll produce a really powerful magnetic field in the gap, between the North Pole and the South Pole, the electromagnet. The electromagnet usually goes something like that. So you got this big magnetic field, which is a lot more powerful than the Earth's magnetic field. The Earth's magnetic field is not that powerful, by the way. It's just powerful enough to move the needle on a compass. But you've probably seen a lot more powerful magnets than that, like your refrigerator magnets. I mean, those are a lot stronger than the Earth's magnetic field. Those are natural magnets. They're not electromagnets. But I mean, an electromagnet is a very powerful magnet, and magnetic fields measured in a unit called Teslas, named after Tesla. And a Tesla is about 10,000 times the strength of the Earth's magnet, or about 20,000 times the strength of the Earth's magnetic field, which is about a half a Gauss. A Gauss is 1/10,000th of a Tesla. So Gauss is kind of a weak magnetic field, but a Tesla is a very strong magnetic field. But you can make electromagnets with strengths of a Tesla or even bigger than that. So you got this big electromagnet, generating a big electric magnetic field, and then you got a big loop of wire, rotating. You have a motor rotating this thing through this magnetic field, and guess what that does? That generates an electric current in the rotating wire. And that it's exactly that current that gets sent to people's homes. You transmit that electricity over transmission cables, and those go into people's homes, and that's what you get when you plug in an electric device. You get what's called alternating current. I mean, a battery will produce a direct current, DC. Batteries involve DC, direct current. But home electricity is alternating current because it's produced by these big electromagnets. And the reason it's alternating is because these things are rotating. The current goes back and forth. It goes positive and negative. But it's still useful. You can still use it to generate power, electric power. That's how we get all our power. Every device in your home, everything that's plugged in, gets electricity from an electric generator, the father or the grandfather of which was this thing on the top right. That's a picture of Faraday's original electromagnetic generator. And nowadays you have these much bigger ones, like the thing on the bottom right. This is a steam-powered electromagnetic generator, electric generator. You have to generate your power by something else, by the way. Power isn't free. Energy is conserved. So that's why we have all these different forms of power that all gets converted to electricity. Hydroelectric power. There's renewable forms of power like hydroelectric, solar, what else? Wind power. But then most of our power comes from fossil fuels, unfortunately. Oil and coal and natural gas. Those are all things that are contributing to climate change, and we really should stop using those as soon as possible, I think. Otherwise, we're just going to have horrible environmental catastrophes, which are probably already inevitable, just based on the amount of fossil fuels we've already burned. But then we have other forms of power too. We have nuclear power. We have geothermal power. I think we should have more nuclear power plants. I know nuclear power got very unpopular during the 1970s because people started working and worrying about, the radiation from the spent fuel, the radioactive waste. They used to worry about nuclear meltdowns. We already had, two really terrible ones. There was one in Chernobyl. There was another terrible one in Japan. I mean, that is a problem, but I think one thing you guys have to realize is that I talk about this in another video, by the way. The dangers from fossil fuels are much, much worse. Not just climate change, but just dangers of disasters. We don't hear about them much, but there's been probably thousands of coal mining disasters, and they're terrible. Coal mining is one of the worst professions in the world. I mean, there's been mines that have collapsed, and even when they don't collapse, I mean, the coal miners get all this soot. They breathe on all this soot and shit. I mean, horrible profession. And there's also terrible, oil refinery disasters. Oil refineries can end up on fire and kill a lot of people too. So coal and oil are a lot more dangerous statistically than nuclear power. And France gets 70% of its energy from nuclear power. And another thing you don't hear much about nuclear power is that, I guess ever since the 1970s, they've outlawed this in the United States, mostly due to ignorance. But it turns out that you can reuse the nuclear waste. You can actually reuse it up to about 10 times. So you can get about 10 times more energy from nuclear power than we're currently getting. So it could last over 100 years easily. And, and France gets 70% of its energy from nuclear power. I mean, the ideal source of energy would be fusion power. Nobody's built a working fusion power plant yet, though, unfortunately. Even though there have been, engineers working on it since the 1950s. We have not succeeded. Nobody succeeded in building a working fusion plant, even though they've been trying two big designs for that, these tokamak reactors and also inertial confinement. And I think we could have had it a long time ago if we'd been putting more money and more resources and had kind of like a Manhattan Project to develop it. And we're probably going to need that. But I don't want to preach too much here. But I got really sidetracked here. But anyway, we can't deny that the electric generator was a really, really important invention. Probably the most important invention of the Industrial Revolution. One that's really revolutionized our society, which it's really allowed for a lot of the conveniences of modern society. So, like a lot of the other inventions did as well. Anyway, that concludes my feature on what I consider the 20 greatest inventions of the Industrial Revolution. Thank you for watching. Keep thinking, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.